Congratulations to CABRI. It's a fundamentally important part of the arsenal of African institutions, and so keep working at it.
Trevor Manuel, who served as Minister of Finance from 1996 to 2009, led a turnaround in the way that public finances were managed in South Africa, building a strong team, providing decisive leadership, creating an inclusive process, and learning along the way were key aspects of South Africa's reform steps. In an interview with CABRI, the Minister shares his insights.
We didn't have the ability to have public officials drawn in at will from outside. Many of the people we drew in didn't have public administrative experience, may have had some kind of policy experience. We couldn't just boot out people who were part of the old administration. So creating an environment of a stable treasury and stable administrative services in that early period was particularly challenging. And so we drew in people with whom we'd worked in the ANC, who were outside of government, some in administration, some in places like the Development Bank, some in the private sector. We also drew in people from outside the country as kind of ODI fellows to assist us in the process. And we're able to establish a cadre of young people who looked at life very differently. I hope that people who felt that they could work hard, be recognized for the hard work, allowed to articulate their views, allowed to test new ideas, and ultimately be part of this great transformation of a fundamental pillar of a democracy in the Treasury. I was always humbled by the kind of people that we could draw into that Treasury. At the time, the financial sector was looking for people with quantitative skills globally, and paying people huge sums of money. And I was always mindful of the fact that most of the smart people drawn into the Treasury could go out into the financial sector and write their own checks at many multiples of what they were earning in the public sector. But that was a humbling experience, and I think that was also the fuel that drove the kind of energy that created this wonderful esprit de corps. At one level, I saw myself as understanding some of the traditions of the ruling party, understanding the policy direction, and having access and therefore being a conduit into decision-making. And that was a distinct role. On the other hand, I also understood that I didn't have the same skill set as the people we were drawing upon, who made up this cadre of management. And so I think the way in which this came together was seeing myself as in a kind of catalytic role. I'd like to believe that the office enjoyed sufficient respect, but it was a respect that didn't need to be manifested in top-level protocols. It was interesting because I knew most of the senior management from before and outside of the formal environment. But within the formal environment, people would all be very deferent, would address me as minister, and step out, and it was okay to be relaxed. And that was a kind of schizophrenia that worked because it created, I think, a workplace environment where we respected the professionalism and responsibilities of each other. I think it also allowed me to, at one level, be part of a team, at another level, to be a catalyst for the team. The more successful I could be at winning the political space, both for policy but also ensuring that the air cover was there from heads of state, the more successful that team would be. Ultimately, one of the takeouts for me from that experience would be that regardless of how good one part of government is, if you aren't populating the rest of government with the same style and the same kind of commitment, you have uneven development. And I think it's one of the issues that we lived through. It's difficult because, in a cabinet system, all ministers are equal, all directors general are equal. I think it's just in the nature of the beast that it would be like that. But the way in which we could then play that out was to allow for a greater sense of inclusion. Some of the policy positions and conventions we developed, I think, were focused on creating a better sense of inclusion. A couple of examples in this regard would be important. Firstly, we introduced a system of medium-term budget statements. So, sort of around October for a February budget, we would go to Parliament, announce what the trend lines were, both in aggregate and sub-aggregate expenditure, so by a kind of functional approach to expenditure, but also an indication of the macroeconomic assumptions, taking a lot of the mystique out of budget announcements, and that worked exceedingly well, both within government but also with the general public. Secondly, I think that we ordered the hearings, medium-term expenditure committee hearings, at an officials level. So departments would come in and make presentations, frequently day-long presentations, to try and distill approaches so that we could then synthesize a budget on the strength of the presentations. Thirdly, we introduced a system called the Ministers' Committee on the Budget. About 8 to 10 ministers who were asked not to talk their own book, but to be part of a collective to evaluate issues, would meet quite frequently. And we also, in the early period, introduced peer reviews. One of the things I've learned about the public service is that innovation is always very difficult. Innovation anywhere introduces risk, and frequently there isn't a concomitant remunerative benefit for taking on risk. I think it's created an environment where public services tend to be exceedingly risk-averse. So what we were doing was trying to introduce too many things at the same time. We had old public servants who were fearing democracy, fearing the you of this new government, fearing the language that people were speaking, because I suppose we were quite reckless. We were kind of super left at the time. All of these things happening. And them only understanding a particular way of doing things, quite isolated from global trends. So you had that. You had overlaid onto that some people who could speak our language and bore the scars of detention, exile, or the underground, and were heaping happening. And so there were contradictions in departments. You had ministers, some of whom were quite ready to roll with new policy and so on. But most of us were finding our feet. And so I don't think it's possible to kind of go faster than the institutional change allows you to go. I think that there's a balance between trying to push the boundaries and knowing that these are boundaries that can be pushed. With all the benefit of hindsight, we knew certain things. We'd never done many of the things we thought we knew. Just like we didn't understand what the contingent liabilities of the apartheid regime were, we didn't know what the capabilities of public servants were. There needed to be a lot of testing. Parts of what we needed to do happened in an environment that was complex. You were saying to the Minister of Education, who was very new to his job, his DG was new to the job. They were trying to fashion an education system with a very activist portfolio committee. One looks at the legislation. I mean, 1995, the Schools Act introduced school governing bodies for all schools. I mean, all of this was very, very early, and then you asked them to take account of systems that would allow for the implementation of ordered spending in provinces. Building schools, paying teachers, getting ghosts out of the system, and perhaps the idea of something that was as forward-looking as the MTF was ahead of its time. Being able to convene horizontally while asking colleagues to take very deep vertical actions was perhaps asking for a bit too much then. As we matured, we were also able to do some things that are exceedingly good for system, but unfortunately aren't adequately utilized. There's a section of the Public Finance Management Act that requires executive authorities to be furnished with the actual expenditures for a month and to sign off on those income and expenditure statements, affording ministers the opportunity to engage with the accounting officer in their department about expenditure trends. And I think that is fundamentally important because it doesn't in any way diminish the role of the accounting officer, but it certainly puts a lot of skin in the game for the executive authority. The other thing that we did was to publish, with a lag of about a month, the actual expenditures in a government gazette, empowering Parliament then to inquire into expenditure trends. And it's not exceedingly difficult to do that kind of thing. Parliament has never taken that up. So the instrument is there, the capacity to deal with it isn't there, and trying to understand how these things work would be quite important. Another measure that we introduced, and I think it's also useful, is to do annual, well, they're now biennial, a budget sort of expenditure reviews. And so it's now done in alternate years for provincial governments and local governments. And producing a publication that examines trends with some retrospect and some perspect, so that you have at least a 5 or 6 year trend of expenditures in provinces and in local government. Again, my sense is that a lot of hard work goes into the production, but I'm never quite sure that the legislatures, be this provincial or municipal, actually have the capacity to look at this and make time to deal with it. So these are ongoing struggles. I think that the capacity and the capability to produce this kind of information is important, but the utilization is something we have to continue to battle for. We introduced some difficulties. I'm not suggesting for a moment that the State Tender Board was perfect. And we thought that one of the things we needed to do on a pilot basis was to allow some departments to undertake their own procurement. So from the side of the Treasury, we would give these departments exemption from the requirements of the State Tender Board. And we weren't actually sufficiently diligent about it. And instead of piloting, everybody grabbed the opportunity because public servants wanted to be involved in the supply chain management issues. And I think that it's actually unleashed the basest kind of human instincts. And I think that a lot of the wrong things that have happened, and those wrong things are manifested certainly in supply chain management, but they also manifest themselves in the political process, because there's the ability to extend patronage, to award contracts, to enrich those within your circle of influence. All of those things have happened because we didn't actually diligently try and deal with the orderly modernization of supply chain management. I think there were parts of it that were planned. The general, I think, architecture of budget documentation, information availability, and so on were part of a plan. But at the same time, for it to operate as per design, it needs a series of things which I think we still don't have. And that is the non-financial information. And you can look at monthly or quarterly reports, you can look at the Auditor General's reports on expenditure, you can see what the financial trends are, but you can't actually see what the money buys. So we haven't invested in adequate systems within line function departments, because especially when one looks at concurrent departments, it would be good to see the Department of Basic Education capable of producing not only the trend line of its own expenditure, what the money bought, but to be able to do this for the 9 provinces, and to do this not just ex post, but to do it in here so that we actually can inform policy and political debates and issues. It would be amazing if we could do that.